story like it was an accident, a tragic fire, a structural collapse, a celebration that went wrong beneath the streets of New Orleans. But that is not what happened. And if you listen closely tonight, you will understand why certain records were buried, why certain names disappeared from ledgers, and why one enslaved woman was hunted across half a continent for the rest of her life. Because what burned that night was not just wood, it was power. It was the illusion that powerful men could gather in secret and never face judgment. Imagine the night, July 4th, 1857. Above ground, the city glittered with fireworks. Music spilled from balconies. Wealthy families raised glasses to liberty, while brass bands marched through humid streets. But beneath the French Quarter, under layers of brick and candle smoke, another celebration was beginning. They called it the Pit, a hidden arena carved from old foundations and forgotten tunnels. No laws entered there, no witnesses survived there. Inside that chamber, lanterns swung from iron hooks. The sand on the ground was dark from years of blood. Wealthy men crowded the wooden balcony above, laughing as coins clinked between their fingers. Planters, judges, traders, men who owned thousands of acres and thousands of human lives. They came for sport, because in the pit, enslaved men and sometimes women were forced to fight for survival while the powerful gambled on their deaths. But for 9 years, one fighter had changed the rhythm of that arena. They called her Savage. They called her Miracle. They called her Number 9. The crowd never cared about the name she was born with, but she remembered it. Asha. Before chains, before the Atlantic crossing, before the auction block, she had been trained to fight in a coastal village in West Africa. Discipline, patience, precision, skills meant to defend life, not entertain men who drank wine while others bled. When raiders burned her village, she was captured, shipped across the ocean, and sold in Louisiana like cargo. Her first master tried to break her in the cane fields. It didn't work. When she struck an overseer who beat a child too long, she was sold again, this time to a man who saw something valuable in her defiance: strength, reflex, profit. He did not give her a name. He gave her a number and a place in the pit. For 9 years, Asha fought under lantern light while crowds screamed for blood. She studied every opponent, every movement, every weakness. But she also studied something else: the balcony above. The men who laughed, the men who financed slave ships, the men who signed execution orders, the men who treated human suffering like a holiday sport. And on the night of July 4th, 1857, Asha decided the pit would burn, not by accident, not by chaos, but by design. Because some men believe power protects them, until the moment the fire starts. And by the time they realize the trap has closed, it is already too late.
The men sitting above the arena believed they were untouchable. That was the first mistake. Power does something strange to the human mind. When a man commands enough money, enough land, enough bodies to bend at his will, he begins to believe the laws of consequence no longer apply to him. The men in that balcony had lived inside that illusion for decades. They were the architects of suffering across Louisiana, plantation kings who controlled rivers of sugar and cotton, judges who signed death sentences with a flick of ink, slave traders who counted human lives like livestock tallies. 33 of them gathered that night beneath the French Quarter. 33 men who believed they were watching entertainment. But Asha knew something they did not. They were being counted. She stepped into the arena barefoot, the sand cold beneath her feet. The chains had just been removed from her wrists, leaving faint scars where iron had lived too long against skin. The crowd roared the moment they saw her. Number 9. The undefeated spectacle. The fighter who had turned brutality into something almost mythic. Men leaned forward over the railing above, eager for violence. Coins exchanged hands. Wagers were shouted. But Asha did not look at the opponent standing across the sand from her. She looked up, slowly, carefully, counting. 1, 2, 3. Her eyes moved across the balcony with quiet precision. She recognized faces she had studied for years. The man with the silver cane who owned 4 plantations along the river. The judge whose courtroom condemned dozens of enslaved people to public execution. The traitor who once laughed while a boy collapsed in the sand during a fight. 9 years of observation had carved their faces into her memory. This was not rage anymore. Rage is loud. Rage burns quickly. What lived inside Asha now was colder, sharper, more patient. It was the kind of anger that waits. The bell rang. Her opponent lunged forward immediately, blade flashing under lantern light. He was tall, heavy, confident. Most men entered the pit thinking strength alone could save them. Most men died learning otherwise. Asha moved just enough. The blade sliced air where she had been a moment before. Steel struck steel with a spark that made the crowd howl. But she was not fighting for spectacle tonight. She was buying time. Above the arena, 2 enslaved workers moved quietly through a narrow service door behind the balcony seating. No one noticed them. No one ever noticed the hands that served them drinks, carried their lamps, cleaned their mess. That invisibility was the second mistake powerful men often make. The workers carried small barrels, oil, lamp fuel. They moved slowly along the back wall of the balcony, placing the barrels beneath wooden support beams. The beams were dry, old, perfect. Below, the fight continued. Her opponent swung again, harder this time. Asha deflected the strike and stepped inside his reach. One precise movement, one calculated cut. The man collapsed into the sand. The crowd exploded in cheers. They thought they were witnessing another victory, another performance, another night of blood sport beneath the city. But they did not understand something fundamental about the nature of traps. The moment people realize they are inside one is never the moment it begins. It begins long before that. It begins when the doors close. It begins when the exits narrow. It begins when the oil quietly seeps into wood above their heads. And it begins when the woman in the arena has already counted every face in the room. 33. All present. Exactly as planned.
The crowd wanted blood. They always did. You must understand something about rooms like the pit. When men gather in darkness to watch suffering, something primitive awakens inside them. Civilization peels away. Titles vanish. Wealth means nothing in that moment. All that remains is appetite. The appetite to dominate. The appetite to witness pain and feel powerful simply by standing above it. The first fighter's body was dragged from the sand while the balcony erupted with laughter and applause. Coins clattered across the wooden rails as bets were settled. The man had lasted less than a minute. For the crowd, it was disappointing. For Asha, it was perfect, because every second mattered. Servants moved through the balcony with trays of whiskey and rum. The barrels of oil hidden along the support beams sat quietly beneath their feet, soaking slowly into the thirsty wood. Still, no one noticed. Men who live surrounded by servants rarely see them. They see hands, they see tools, they do not see minds. Another fighter was shoved into the arena. He was younger, barely more than a boy. His hands trembled as he gripped the blade forced into them. The crowd booed immediately. Fear ruined the entertainment. Asha watched him carefully. She knew that look. She had seen it hundreds of times in the pit. The look of someone who understood that survival tonight meant killing another prisoner for the amusement of men who would never risk their own blood. The bell rang. The boy charged clumsily, swinging too wide, too desperate. Asha blocked the strike easily. Steel rang through the chamber. They circled. The crowd shouted insults. One plantation owner leaned over the railing and yelled, "Finish him!" But as the boy lunged again, Asha stepped closer instead of away. Their blades locked for a moment. In the roar of the crowd, she whispered something so quiet only he could hear. "Fall when I strike." The boy's eyes flickered with confusion, then realization. The next movement happened fast. Asha twisted her blade across his shoulder, shallow enough to avoid bone, but deep enough to spill convincing blood. The boy screamed and collapsed exactly as she had told him. From the balcony, it looked fatal. The crowd erupted in savage approval. Servants rushed forward and dragged him from the sand, alive, a small mercy hidden inside brutality. But mercy was not the real purpose of tonight. Above the arena, the workers had finished placing the final oil barrel. One of them slipped away through the narrow service door again. Behind stacked crates, a single torch waited. Not yet. Timing mattered. Below, the third fighter entered, and the energy in the pit shifted instantly. This one was different. Massive, scarred, a veteran of the arena. The kind of man who had survived years by becoming exactly what the crowd wanted, violence shaped into a weapon. The balcony roared louder than before. This was the fight they wanted. Steel collided the moment the bell rang. The giant fighter attacked with brutal force, driving Asha backward through the sand. The crowd slammed fists against the railing, screaming for blood. Above them, the wood beneath their boots had already begun to darken with oil, but their attention was locked downward, exactly where Asha needed it. She moved faster now, more aggressively, every strike louder, every movement more dramatic. She wanted the crowd standing, she wanted them shouting, she wanted their attention completely consumed by the spectacle below, because a distracted crowd does not notice smoke. And when smoke finally appears, it is already far too late. Somewhere behind the balcony wall, a trembling hand reached toward the waiting torch, and in the arena below, Asha made sure every eye remained fixed on the sand.
Powerful men rarely believe they are in danger. That is the first weakness of power. The balcony shook with stomping boots as the crowd leaned forward, hungry for the finish. The giant in the arena roared and swung his blade downward with brutal force. Steel slammed against steel. Sparks jumped into the lantern light. To the crowd, it looked like chaos, but Asha was not fighting chaotically. Every step was measured, every retreat intentional. She allowed the larger man to drive her backward toward the center of the arena. He swung again, heavy and reckless, the kind of strike meant to shatter bone. She slipped aside, the blade buried into the sand. For a moment, his weight shifted too far forward. That was the opening. Asha's blade snapped upward in one clean motion, not to kill, not yet, but to remove control. The strike smashed across his wrist. His weapon flew from his hand and skidded across the sand. The crowd exploded with noise. They loved reversals. They loved the moment when victory slipped from one man's fingers and landed in another's. The giant staggered back, clutching his arm. Asha stepped forward slowly. She raised her blade. From the balcony, it looked like execution. The crowd began chanting, "Finish it! Finish it! Finish it!" Above them, the torch had finally touched the wood. At first, the flame was small, almost polite, a thin orange thread creeping along the beam where oil had soaked deep into dry timber.
One of the workers stepped back, eyes wide, watching the fire begin its quiet crawl beneath the seating platform. Below, Asha lowered her blade slightly. She did not rush the kill. Timing mattered more than blood. The giant lunged again, desperate now, grabbing for her throat with his uninjured hand. She pivoted and drove her elbow into his jaw. Bone cracked. He collapsed to his knees. The arena fell silent for a single heartbeat. Then Asha ended the fight. One precise strike. The giant dropped face first into the sand, dead before his body stopped moving. The pit exploded with cheers. Men slammed fists against the railing so hard the balcony trembled. Coins flew through the air. Wine splashed across the wooden boards. No one noticed the thin ribbon of smoke beginning to curl upward behind them. No one noticed the fire sliding along the beams beneath their feet, because men drunk on power rarely look behind them. They only look down. The owner of the pit stood up now, raising his glass high. His voice boomed across the arena. "Tonight we celebrate freedom!" Laughter erupted. The irony never reached them. The owner leaned forward, grinning down at Asha. "One more fight!" The crowd roared approval instantly. More blood, more spectacle. But the truth was already unfolding behind the balcony wall. The fire had grown stronger now. Oil-fed flames ran along the timber like hunting animals, spreading across the hidden skeleton of the structure. Wood popped softly, then cracked. Below, two more fighters were shoved into the arena, both hardened men, both killers who had survived the pit for years. Asha stood still in the center of the sand. Her chest rose slowly with controlled breaths. She looked up at the balcony again, counting. 1, 2, 3, 33. Every face she had memorized. Planters, judges, traders, men who signed papers that decided whether human beings lived or died, men who believed they were untouchable inside their secret arena. The bell rang again. The two fighters charged her at once. Steel clashed violently as Asha moved between them. The crowd screamed louder than ever. And finally, one man in the balcony wrinkled his nose. He smelled something. Smoke. He turned his head slightly, just as the first thin tongue of flame pushed through the wood beneath his seat. He opened his mouth to speak, but the roar of the crowd drowned his voice. Below, Asha ducked a strike and twisted away, her eyes lifted again, watching the balcony, waiting. Because once fire begins climbing dry timber soaked in oil, it does not ask permission. It only spreads. And when the first man finally shouted "Fire!" it was already too late.
The first scream was not loud. Not at first. It slipped into the noise like a cracked note in a song. One man on the balcony stood suddenly, slapping at the bottom of his chair as heat licked through the wood beneath him. For a second, the others laughed. They thought he had spilled wine. Then the flames broke through the planks. Orange fingers clawed upward between their boots. The laughter stopped. Smoke rolled across the ceiling like a dark tide. Below them, steel clashed again as Asha fought both opponents at once. But something had shifted in the arena. The crowd's roar had changed. Confusion began to ripple through the balcony rows. "Sit down! Finish the fight! Someone move him!" But the man who had stood first was no longer shouting. His coat had caught fire. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, swatting desperately at flames crawling across expensive fabric. Another man turned to help him. Then he saw the beam behind them, burning. The fire had found its path. Oil soaked into the wood over years of careless storage and drunken excess had become a perfect trail. Flames raced across the beams beneath the balcony floor. The wood groaned, and suddenly someone finally understood. "Fire!" This time the word cut through everything. Men leapt from their seats, glasses shattered, coins scattered across the planks. The narrow stairway that led up toward the street entrance filled instantly with bodies trying to escape. But the fire had reached that staircase first. The lower half was already burning. Smoke surged upward. A wall of heat blocked the exit. Panic erupted. Men who had spent their lives commanding others suddenly shoved and clawed like trapped animals. One plantation owner tried to push past a judge twice his age. The judge swung a bottle at his head. The bottle broke. Blood mixed with smoke. Below, the fighters in the arena hesitated. Even they could feel the heat now. Ash began drifting down into the sand. One of Asha's opponents glanced upward, confusion breaking his focus. That was the mistake. Asha disarmed him in one clean motion. His blade flew across the arena. The second fighter lunged wildly. She twisted aside. His momentum carried him into the wall. By the time he turned back toward her, Asha's blade was already at his throat. She didn't kill him. She shoved him hard into the sand instead. "Stay down," she whispered. He obeyed instantly. Above them, the balcony erupted into chaos. Flames tore through the support beams. Men trampled each other trying to reach exits that were already collapsing. A lantern fell from the railing. It shattered against the arena floor. Oil spilled into the sand and ignited in a sudden burst of fire. Now the heat was everywhere. Smoke poured downward into the pit. The owner of the arena screamed orders no one followed. Guards tried to force open a side door. The hinges were already warped from heat. A crack like thunder exploded through the chamber. One of the main beams gave way. The balcony lurched violently. Men grabbed railings. Some slipped. Some fell. One traitor crashed directly into the arena below, his body slamming into the sand with a sickening thud. His coat was still burning. More cracks followed. The wooden structure above had become a collapsing furnace. Asha stepped backward through the growing haze. She knew exactly what was coming. 9 years in the pit had taught her every sound the structure made. She recognized the scream of wood under heat, the breaking of beams, the shift before collapse. She turned toward the far wall of the arena, toward a small service tunnel almost no one else knew existed. Behind her, the balcony finally failed. With a roar of splintering timber and human screams, half the structure collapsed inward, burning boards, shattered chairs, bodies, all crashing into the arena in a rain of fire. The pit had become a grave. Smoke filled the chamber so thick it swallowed the lantern light. Men who once laughed at suffering now clawed through flames, begging for air. Asha paused only once. She looked back at the collapsing balcony. 33 men had come there that night believing they controlled the world. Now the world was burning around them. Then she stepped into the tunnel and disappeared into the darkness while the arena above collapsed into fire.
The tunnel swallowed the sound of screaming, but not completely. Some noises follow you no matter how far you walk. The passage was narrow enough that Asha's shoulders brushed damp brick as she moved forward. Smoke chased her through the corridor, thin at first, then thicker as the arena behind her collapsed piece by piece. She did not run blindly. Running wastes breath, and breath was precious now. Each inhale tasted like ash. Each step echoed softly in the stone throat of the tunnel. For 9 years she had memorized these passages, not because anyone taught her, because survival demands study. While the crowd above drank and cheered, she had watched the workers who moved through these hidden corridors. She watched where they entered, where they disappeared, where the brick changed color from damp air, where cool winds slipped through cracks in the walls. Those details were not accidents, they were maps, maps to freedom. Behind her, the roar of the fire deepened into something monstrous, wood collapsing, stone cracking. The pit was dying, and with it, the illusion of safety that had protected the men who gathered there. Asha counted her steps as she moved, 12 forward, left turn, 20 more, then a narrow incline where the floor sloped upward toward a supply corridor. The smoke thinned slightly there. Fresh air leaked through old ventilation cracks cut into the foundation decades earlier. She paused for the first time, just one breath, not for rest, for listening. Footsteps echoed somewhere behind her, more than one set, soft, careful, not soldiers, workers. 3 figures appeared through the haze, coughing, faces streaked with soot. Enslaved men who had carried barrels through the balcony door earlier that night. They stopped when they saw her. For a moment no one spoke. They all understood what had happened. One of them looked back toward the direction of the arena. The tunnel behind them pulsed with orange light. "Is it done?" he asked quietly. Asha nodded once. That was enough. No celebration followed, no cheers, only a long silence filled with the distant thunder of collapsing timber. Because men who live under chains understand something most people never learn. Victory is rarely loud. It is quiet, heavy, and dangerous. "Exit?" another worker asked. Asha pointed down the tunnel. 2 turns ahead, storage hatch. They began moving again, faster now. The corridor twisted through the underground like a buried artery. Crates lined sections of the wall where supplies for the arena had once been stored. Old ropes, broken lanterns, rusting tools, artifacts of cruelty disguised as entertainment. Halfway through the passage, the ground shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. A deep rumble rolled through the stone. The arena above had finally given way completely. The pit was collapsing into itself. None of them stopped. They reached the final corridor moments later. At the end waited a wooden hatch disguised beneath stacked crates in an abandoned supply shed several streets away from the arena entrance. Asha pushed the crates aside. The wood above them rattled with muffled noise from the city. Fireworks, music, distant cheering. New Orleans was still celebrating Independence Day. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't so bitter. Above ground, they toasted freedom. Below ground, men had just burned alive for believing they owned it. Asha pressed her shoulder against the hatch. It resisted at first, swollen wood from humidity. Then it gave. Cool night air poured into the tunnel. One by one, they climbed out into the darkness of the storage shed. The city beyond buzzed with distant celebration. Lanterns glowed down the alleyways. Music drifted through open balconies. And somewhere far behind them, smoke began rising into the night sky from beneath the French Quarter. At first, no one noticed. Fires were common in port cities, but this one was different. This fire carried secrets. 33 powerful men had walked into the pit that night, expecting blood sport. None of them would walk out. The workers slipped into the shadows of the alley without another word. Everyone understood the next part. Survive, disappear, say nothing. Asha remained in the shed for a moment longer. She untied the cloth wrapped around her wrist. The number burned into the fabric stared back at her. Fighter 9, the name the arena had given her, the name the crowd had screamed for 9 years. She dropped the cloth onto the dirt floor. For the first time since chains closed around her wrists years ago, she walked into the night as something else. Not property, not entertainment, not a number. Something far more dangerous, free. And the city had no idea yet that its most powerful men had just vanished into smoke. By morning, the city called it an accident. That was the official story. A fire beneath the French Quarter, a hidden cellar, a tragic collapse that killed several respected businessmen. But inside the governor's office, the truth was already known. The pit had not been a rumor. It had been a network, a private entertainment circle for men too wealthy to fear consequences. Planters, bankers, politicians, and many of them had died screaming beneath burning timber the night before. The survivors demanded one thing: revenge. By noon, posters appeared across New Orleans, not for the fighters who escaped, not for the men who ran the arena, for one woman. The poster showed a rough charcoal sketch, strong jaw, braided hair, eyes that looked directly at the artist. The words underneath were simple: Wanted, Asha.
$5,000 reward, dead or alive. In 1857, that was enough money to buy a plantation. Hunters began arriving within days. Slave catchers, mercenaries, men who had spent their lives tracking people through forests and swamps. But they had a problem. Asha had vanished. The tunnels beneath New Orleans stretched for miles. Old drainage routes, forgotten smuggling passages, collapsed colonial basements. Most people got lost within minutes, but Asha had studied those tunnels for years. While others slept between fights, she memorized the city beneath the city. 3 nights after the fire, a fisherman near the Mississippi River swore he saw a woman climb from a drainage outlet before disappearing into the marsh. A week later, a plantation guard in Baton Rouge reported a strange attack. 3 overseers found tied to a tree, their whips burned in a pile beside them. 2 weeks later, a slave transport wagon outside Lafayette was ambushed. The driver survived long enough to tell the story. He said the attackers moved silently through the trees, but the one leading them was a woman. Word spread quickly, not through newspapers, through whispers. Enslaved workers passing rumors between fields, dock hands exchanging quiet stories at night. They began calling her something new. Not number 9, not Asha. They called her the Ghost of the Pit, because wherever slave traders moved people through Louisiana, someone began interfering. Wagons disappeared, chains were cut, entire groups of captives vanished into the swamps. The bounty hunters searched for months, then years, but every lead ended the same way. Footprints disappearing into water, fires burning slave ledgers, guards found unconscious in the mud, and sometimes a single message carved in wood nearby. 2 simple symbols, XI, the number they had forced on her. But now it meant something different. Not a prisoner, a warning. By 1861, when the American Civil War finally exploded across the country, the bounty posters were faded and torn. The men who once demanded Asha's head were dead, bankrupt, or too busy fighting a war they could no longer control. But in quiet corners of Louisiana, people still told stories about a woman who moved through the swamps like a shadow, about chains that mysteriously unlocked, about slave patrols that turned around in terror after seeing a figure standing silently in the fog. No one ever proved those stories were true, but one thing was recorded in a Union Army report from 1863. A scouting unit deep in Louisiana encountered a group of formerly enslaved people traveling north. The officer asked who had helped them escape. The group pointed toward the swamp and said a single name, Asha. The officer asked where she was. One of the men just smiled and answered quietly, "She doesn't stay anywhere. Not for long."
By the time the war ended in 1865, the bounty for Asha had quietly disappeared. No announcement, no explanation. The men who once demanded her capture had either lost everything or were trying very hard to erase their connection to the pit. Because the more investigators looked into the fire beneath New Orleans, the uglier the truth became. Hidden gambling ledgers were discovered in the ruins, names of powerful men, payments made for fighters, ship manifests that listed human beings beside barrels of sugar and cotton. The story was too dangerous to publish, so the records were sealed. The newspapers kept printing the same explanation: structural fire, unfortunate accident. But history has a strange habit of surviving anyway, especially when people refuse to forget. Formerly enslaved families across Louisiana passed down stories about the woman from the pit. Children heard them whispered by lantern light. A fighter who burned a secret arena,
a woman who moved through swamps like fog, a rebel who left chains broken and patrols terrified. Over time, the stories grew. Some said she could vanish into water without a sound. Others said she could track a man for miles through the marsh by the way his footsteps disturbed the reeds. One story claimed she walked directly into a Confederate camp one night, cut open the prisoner chains, and disappeared before anyone realized what had happened. Of course, historians later argued about the truth. Some believed Asha had died in the fire. Others believed she escaped north and joined the Union. But the most interesting evidence surfaced decades later. In 1893, an old woman visited a small church in southern Louisiana. She was tall, her hair had turned silver, but her posture was straight, like someone who had spent a lifetime fighting to survive. The priest who spoke with her later wrote a short note in the church records. The woman had asked to see something very specific, not the Bible, not a confession. She wanted to see the iron chains the church kept from an old slave auction. The priest brought them out from storage. She studied them quietly for a long time. Then she touched one of the shackles and said something strange. "Too weak." The priest asked what she meant. The woman smiled faintly and tapped the metal. "Too breakable." When she left, the priest noticed something carved faintly into the wooden bench where she had been sitting. Two small symbols, I-X. The priest wrote the story down because the mark bothered him. He said it looked less like graffiti and more like a signature. No one ever confirmed who the woman was, but by then the legend of the ghost of the pit had already spread through the Gulf Coast. A woman who burned the arena of powerful men, a fighter who turned her chains into a weapon, and a name that slave hunters once feared to speak out loud. Asha, the woman who refused to stay owned, the woman who vanished into the swamps, and the woman who proved that sometimes history's most dangerous revolutions.
For decades, the story refused to die. Even as cities grew, railroads expanded, and the scars of the war slowly faded, whispers about the woman from the pit continued moving through the Gulf Coast like a quiet current. Most people dismissed it as folklore, a ghost story told by grandparents, a legend meant to give hope to people who had once lived in chains. But sometimes, legends leave traces. In 1908, workers repairing a collapsed cellar beneath the old streets of New Orleans uncovered something strange. Burned beams, iron rings bolted into stone, and fragments of rusted chains buried beneath layers of dirt. The city inspector who examined the site assumed it had once been a storage chamber destroyed in a fire decades earlier. But one young historian from Tulane University noticed something that didn't match the official explanation. The iron rings were positioned at regular intervals around the chamber walls, like restraints, like the boundary of an arena. The historian spent weeks studying the site, comparing it with property records and city maps. Eventually, he wrote a small research note suggesting the space may have been used for illegal gambling events in the 1800s. His report was never widely published. Too many names from powerful families appeared in the surrounding land records. But before the chamber was sealed again, he photographed one final detail. Carved into one of the charred support posts was a symbol, not a name, just two letters. I-X. Years later, when the photograph surfaced in a university archive, an elderly archivist recognized the symbol immediately because she had seen it before, scratched into the back of an old wooden bench in a rural Louisiana church, the same place where, many years earlier, a tall, silver-haired woman had once visited and quietly examined a pair of old slave shackles. The archivist remembered the story the priest had written in the church logbook. how the woman had tapped the iron chain and said softly, "Too weak." The archivist closed the file slowly, because by then she understood something historians often forget. Official records rarely preserve the most dangerous truths. Those survive somewhere else, in whispered stories, in carved marks, in symbols left behind by people who refuse to disappear quietly. And across the Gulf Coast, from river towns to swamp villages, the same small symbol had appeared again and again over the years, carved into old docks, scratched into abandoned slave quarters, hidden in places only careful eyes would notice. IX. The number meant to erase a woman's identity, the mark of a fighter who turned a cage into a weapon, and the quiet reminder that somewhere in the long shadow of history, a woman named Asha once burned the arena of the powerful and walked away into the dark. By the early 20th century, the story had almost faded. New generations filled the streets of New Orleans. Automobiles replaced horse carts. Electric lights erased the darkness where old legends once lived. Most people no longer believed the tale of the pit. To them, it sounded impossible. A secret arena beneath the city, wealthy men gambling on human lives, a single fighter burning it all down. History books rarely mentioned it. But some people still listened for older voices. In 1934, during the Great Depression, interviewers from the Works Progress Administration traveled through the southern United States, collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people. Many of the people they interviewed were over 80 years old. Their memories stretched back to a world that had almost disappeared. Plantations, slave patrols, hidden escape routes through forests and swamps. Most interviews followed the same pattern: childhood memories, family stories, fragments of songs. But in a small Louisiana river town, one interviewer recorded something unusual. An elderly man named Samuel, who claimed to have been a child during the late 1850s, described a night when strangers appeared near his plantation. Not soldiers, not slave catchers, rescuers. He said they moved silently through the trees, cutting chains and guiding people toward the swamp. The interviewer asked who led them. Samuel smiled. "A woman," he said. "Tall, strong, quiet. She didn't speak much," he explained, "but when she did, people listened, because she knew the land, the rivers, the hidden paths through the marsh that no patrol could follow." The interviewer asked the obvious question, "What was her name?" Samuel leaned back in his chair and thought for a long moment. Then he answered slowly, "We called her Asha." The interviewer wrote the name down, but before closing his notebook, he asked one more thing. "Did you ever see her again?" Samuel shook his head. "No." Then he added something that puzzled the interviewer. "But sometimes," he looked toward the dark line of swamp forest beyond the town, "sometimes people still see the mark." The interviewer asked what mark he meant. Samuel reached down, picked up a small pocket knife, and carved 2 letters into the wooden table beside him. IX. The blade scratched softly through the wood. Samuel studied the mark for a moment, then closed the knife. "They tried to turn her into a number," he said, "but numbers travel." The interviewer never forgot that sentence. Years later, when the interview transcripts were stored in federal archives, the final page of Samuel's interview contained a small handwritten note from the interviewer himself, a quiet observation written in the margin. A symbol, IX, appears in several unrelated interviews across Louisiana, possibly a folk legend, but unusually consistent. The note ended with one final sentence:
If the story is true, the woman they called Asha was never captured. And somewhere in the history of the American South, that unfinished ending may be the most powerful part of the story.
History often forgets people who refuse to fit neatly into records, especially people who frightened the powerful. After the interviews collected by the Works Progress Administration were archived in the 1930s, the story of Asha sat quietly in boxes for decades. Dust gathered. Scholars occasionally opened the files while researching slavery in Louisiana, but most dismissed the legend as folklore. Stories grow over time, memories shift, and revolutions sometimes become myths. But one detail kept troubling historians. The same symbol appeared again and again in unrelated testimonies. IX. It showed up in different towns, different years, different families who had never met each other. For something to spread that consistently, historians realized, it usually meant one thing. At some point in the past, something real had happened. In the 1960s, during the American Civil Rights Movement, a young graduate student studying at Tulane University stumbled across those WPA interviews. He had been researching underground resistance among enslaved people before the Civil War, small rebellions, hidden escape routes, quiet networks of resistance that never appeared in official plantation records. When he read Samuel's interview describing the woman named Asha, the student felt something strange. The story sounded too detailed to be pure myth. The student began digging deeper. Old property maps of New Orleans, insurance records from the 1850s, fire reports filed during the week of Independence Day in 1857. Eventually, he found a short notice buried in an old newspaper archive, a single paragraph describing a subterranean fire beneath a private cellar gathering. Several prominent businessmen had died. The cause was listed as accidental, but the article mentioned something curious. Witnesses reported hearing shouting and fighting shortly before the fire began. The graduate student wrote a research paper suggesting the fire may have been connected to illegal gambling events involving enslaved fighters. His professor advised him not to publish it. Too much speculation, too little proof. So the paper stayed in a university drawer. But before filing it away, the student added one final observation at the end of his notes. If the pit had really existed, and if Asha had truly destroyed it, then her rebellion might have done something more powerful than killing a few wealthy gamblers. It might have created a legend, a symbol of resistance, the kind of story that spreads quietly among people who have been denied power. The student closed the file and looked again at the strange mark appearing throughout the interviews. IX. The number meant to erase a person's identity. Instead, it became something stronger, a message, a reminder that even in the darkest systems ever created, someone eventually stands up. Someone breaks the chains, and sometimes they burn the entire arena down. By the late 20th century, the story of Asha existed mostly in scattered places. A few dusty archive boxes, fragments of interviews collected by the Works Progress Administration, an unpublished research paper from Tulane University, and the quiet oral traditions still shared in parts of southern Louisiana. Historians debated it endlessly. Some argued the pit had never existed. They believed the fire reported in New Orleans in 1857 was simply a cellar accident exaggerated by folklore. Others believed something darker had happened. Because secret fighting arenas were not unheard of in the 1800s, illegal gambling houses existed in many port cities, and New Orleans, with its maze of tunnels and basements beneath the French Quarter, had always been a place where certain things could stay hidden.
But one detail kept the mystery alive: the symbol, IX. By the 1980s, historians cataloging plantation artifacts noticed the mark appearing in unexpected places, scratched into the inside of shackles, carved faintly into wooden posts in abandoned slave cabins, once even discovered on the underside of a dock plank near the Mississippi River. None of the marks were large. None of them were meant to be obvious. They looked more like quiet signatures or messages left for someone who knew what they meant. One historian studying resistance among enslaved communities proposed a theory. Maybe IX had become a symbol shared among people who had escaped slavery or helped others escape. A secret mark, a signal that someone nearby had once fought back. If that theory was true, then Asha's rebellion had done something extraordinary. It had outlived her. Because long after the pit burned, long after the slave system itself collapsed, the mark remained. 2 letters carved into wood and iron across the Gulf Coast, a reminder that someone once refused to accept the role forced upon her, someone who turned a number into a weapon. Someone who proved that even the most powerful systems can collapse when the right person decides to stop obeying. And maybe that is why the story never truly ends. No confirmed grave, no final record of capture, no proof that Asha ever died in the swamps where the legends placed her. History leaves her exactly where the legend needs her to be, somewhere beyond the reach of the men who tried to own her. Somewhere beyond the records that tried to erase her, still moving through the shadows of the past, still carrying the mark they gave her, IX, the number meant to break her, the symbol that made her impossible to forget. In modern archives, the story of Asha sits in an unusual place. Not quite legend, not quite proven history. Researchers studying slavery and resistance in the American South sometimes encounter the same strange trail of evidence. Fragments, a fire report from 1857 in New Orleans, oral histories collected decades later by the Works Progress Administration, a research note hidden in the archives of Tulane University. None of these documents alone prove the story, but together they form something historians recognize well: a pattern. History is full of stories that began this way, small clues scattered across time, pieces that seem insignificant until someone notices how they connect. The pit, the fire, the escaped fighters, the rescues in the swamps, and always the same mark appearing quietly in the margins of the past: IX. Historians who specialize in resistance movements know something important about symbols like that. They rarely appear by accident. Symbols spread when people need them, when a story becomes powerful enough to carry hope. Because for enslaved people in the 1800s, hope was often the most dangerous thing of all. Hope meant rebellion. Hope meant escape. Hope meant believing that even the strongest system built to control human lives could someday collapse. If the legend of Asha was true, then her greatest victory may not have been burning the arena beneath the city. It may have been what came afterward. The idea that one person had stood up inside a system designed to crush rebellion and shattered it. Stories like that travel, quietly, from one generation to the next, and sometimes they last longer than the empires that tried to silence them. That is why the symbol still fascinates researchers today. IX, a number forced onto a fighter to erase her identity, a number that became a message instead, a message that someone, somewhere once fought back. And when historians close the final archive folder and look at the scattered evidence left behind, they usually arrive at the same quiet conclusion. Whether every detail of the story is true or not, someone inspired it. Someone real, someone dangerous enough that the powerful men of the time wanted the world to forget she ever existed. But history has a strange habit. The harder someone tries to erase a story, the more stubbornly it survives.
Every historical legend eventually reaches the same moment. The point where the records stop. The point where the evidence runs out. For the story of Asha, that moment comes somewhere in the swamps of southern Louisiana after the late 1850s. No arrest record, no confirmed death, no grave marked with her name. The official history simply goes silent. But the silence itself tells historians something important, because the people who once wanted Asha captured had enormous power. Plantation owners, judges, merchants connected to the slave trade. If they had caught her, the record would almost certainly exist. Punishments in that era were rarely hidden, especially when the powerful wanted to send a warning. Yet no execution report appears in the archives of New Orleans, no prison transfer, no trial, just the fading bounty notices and the growing legends. That absence created a mystery historians still discuss today. Did Asha disappear into the swamps and live the rest of her life quietly? Did she escape north and vanish among free communities during the years before the American Civil War? Or did the stories about her grow so powerful that they slowly transformed one person into a symbol? No one can say with certainty, but symbols often outlive the people who create them. And the mark associated with her story continued appearing long after the world she fought against had collapsed. The mark of the woman who burned the pit, the woman history tried to bury, and the woman the past never fully managed to erase. It appears in places historians still catalog today, on tools recovered from old plantation sites, carved faintly into wood beams in abandoned cabins, even scratched into the underside of a rusted shackle preserved in a small museum near the Mississippi River. None of the marks are dramatic. None of them are meant for crowds. They are quiet, hidden, almost like messages meant only for people who already understand the story. A reminder that someone once fought back. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending Asha could have. Not a statue, not a monument, but a story that refuses to disappear. A story that survived fires, wars, and generations of silence. A story about a fighter who was given a number instead of a name and turned that number into a legend. The mark of the woman who burned the pit, the woman history tried to bury, and the woman the past never fully managed to erase. Today, millions of people walk through the streets of New Orleans every year. They visit the old balconies of the French Quarter. They listen to music drifting from clubs along Bourbon Street. They explore museums that tell the complicated history of the American South. Very few of them know that beneath parts of the city lies a maze of older foundations, collapsed basements, forgotten tunnels, stone chambers from buildings that no longer exist. Most of these spaces are sealed. Some are flooded. Others are simply too dangerous to explore. But historians who study the early city records know something interesting. Several underground structures were destroyed in a mysterious fire during the summer of 1857. The same fire quietly recorded in a short municipal report that mentioned a subterranean gathering gone wrong. Over the years, archaeologists have occasionally uncovered fragments from those underground spaces. Burned beams, iron rings set into stone, pieces of rusted chain. None of those discoveries prove the legend of the pit, but they make one thing clear. Something burned down there.
something violent enough to collapse an entire underground chamber. And somewhere in the story of that fire appears a woman who refused to be erased. In academic discussions today, historians often debate how legends form. Sometimes they grow from imagination. Sometimes they grow from exaggerated truths. But the most powerful legends usually come from a different place. Real events that frightened powerful people enough that they tried to hide them. The story of Asha sits exactly in that uncertain space between history and legend. A fighter forced into an underground arena, a rebellion that ended in flames, a woman who escaped into the Louisiana swamps and was never captured, and a symbol left behind in quiet corners of the past. 9. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the symbol is how small it always is. Never carved into monuments, never written across walls. Just 2 small letters scratched into wood or iron, almost like a whisper across time. A whisper reminding anyone who notices it that the past is full of people who fought back. People who never appeared in official records. People who changed history in ways that can't always be measured. Because sometimes the most powerful act in history isn't building something. Sometimes it's destroying something that should never have existed in the first place. And in the summer of 1857, somewhere beneath the streets of New Orleans, one woman may have done exactly that, turning a number meant to erase her identity into a legend that survived long after the flames died. After the fire, something strange happened in New Orleans. Not chaos, not riots, not open rebellion. Something far more unsettling. Silence. For weeks after the underground arena burned, the city continued moving as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Markets opened at sunrise. Ships docked along the Mississippi. Merchants counted coins in counting houses. Music still spilled from balconies at night. But beneath the rhythm of ordinary life, a quiet shift had begun. 33 powerful men had vanished in a single night. Not laborers, not criminals. Men who controlled plantations, courts, and shipping routes across the Southern economy. When men like that disappeared, the consequences spread far beyond one city. Plantations upriver suddenly found themselves without owners. Business partners discovered that contracts had been signed by men who were now ashes beneath brick and stone. Courtrooms stalled when judges failed to appear. Shipping accounts froze when the financiers behind them could no longer sign papers. The power structure that had seemed permanent began showing fractures. And yet, the official explanation remained strangely brief. City records described the disaster as a structural fire in a private cellar gathering. No detailed investigation, no public trials, no serious attempt to expose what had really existed beneath the streets. Why? Because revealing the truth would have exposed something the elite of the South could not afford to admit. That powerful men had been secretly gathering to watch enslaved people fight to the death for entertainment. If that truth had reached Northern newspapers in 1857, it would have fueled outrage across the United States. And at that exact moment in history, the nation was already standing on the edge of something dangerous. Just 3 years later, in 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln would ignite a political explosion. And in 1861, the country would descend into the catastrophe now remembered as the American Civil War. In the years leading up to that war, Southern elites were desperate to control public perception. Stories of brutality, rebellion, and slave resistance were dangerous. So the fire beneath New Orleans quietly disappeared from the newspapers. But rumors cannot be buried as easily as reports. dock workers whispered about the night the pit burned. Field hands carried the story from plantation to plantation. In back rooms and riverboats, people repeated the same strange detail again and again. The fighter who started the fire had a number instead of a name, 9. And before the flames consumed the arena, she had counted the men above her one by one, as if the entire night had not been chaos, but judgment. And the most terrifying part for the men who survived that era was this: the woman they blamed was never captured. She vanished into the forests and rivers of Louisiana. No trial, no execution, no proof she was dead, which meant that somewhere out there, the legend of the gladiator who burned the pit could still be walking free. And sometimes, in the psychology of power, uncertainty is more frightening than punishment, because a captured enemy can be silenced, but a ghost in the system can haunt a nation for generations. Power has always relied on one simple weapon: control the story, and you control the memory. After the arena burned beneath New Orleans, the most powerful men still standing across the South moved quickly, not publicly, not with speeches or proclamations, quietly, silently, because the truth about what happened that night was more dangerous than the fire itself. 33 elite men had gathered in secret to watch enslaved fighters tear each other apart for sport. If that truth reached the wider nation, it would expose a brutality the Southern aristocracy had spent decades trying to disguise. So the strategy was simple: erase the story. Within weeks, the newspapers changed their language. What had first been whispered as a mysterious disaster slowly became described as a simple warehouse fire. No mention of the underground arena, no mention of forced combat, no mention of the enslaved fighters who had been used as entertainment, and absolutely no mention of the woman called 9. Records were altered. Witnesses disappeared from official reports. Even city officials avoided discussing the incident publicly, because secrets are the true currency of power, and the elite families of Louisiana had spent generations protecting theirs. But here is the truth powerful institutions always forget. You can silence documents, you cannot silence memory. The people who had seen the pit did not forget. Dock workers who delivered supplies there remembered the smell of blood that seeped through the brick tunnels. Servants who carried lantern oil into the arena remembered the cheers that echoed beneath the city streets. Enslaved laborers who had heard the fights from above ground remembered the screams that followed each bell. And slowly, quietly, those memories began spreading. Stories passed from mouth to mouth across plantations and river towns. Some said the woman who burned the arena had been trained as a warrior long before she was enslaved. Others said she had spent 9 years studying the men who owned the pit, learning their habits, learning their arrogance, waiting for the one night when their guard would drop. Independence Day, July 4th. A holiday meant to celebrate freedom in a country where millions remained in chains. The symbolism alone made the story impossible to erase. A woman enslaved by the system had destroyed a gathering of the very men who profited from it. Not in open rebellion, not in a riot, but through patience, strategy, and fire. Over time, the details began shifting, as legends always do. Some storytellers claimed she escaped north along the Mississippi River. Others believed she vanished deep into the Louisiana swamps, where slave patrols rarely survived. A few insisted she joined networks that later helped enslaved people flee north toward freedom. No version could be confirmed, but every version shared one detail: she was never captured. And that detail mattered more than any official record. Because in a society built on the illusion of total control, the idea that one person could break the system and disappear was deeply unsettling. It meant the structure wasn't invincible. It meant the powerful could bleed. And once a man realizes power can be challenged, he never sees the world the same way again. That is why the story of the gladiator who burned the pit survived. Not in textbooks, not in government records, but in whispers carried through generations. Because sometimes the most dangerous knowledge in history is not what is written down, it is what refuses to be forgotten.
If you want to understand how power truly works, you must stop looking at kings and presidents. Look instead at the systems they build. Because systems can commit crimes that individuals could never survive being blamed for. The underground arena beneath New Orleans was not simply a place of violence. It was a machine, a carefully engineered ecosystem of cruelty. And machines like that do not appear overnight. They are designed, funded, protected. Think about it. An arena hidden beneath a bustling city required architects, builders, guards, suppliers, gamblers, and officials willing to look the other way. It required silence, and silence requires reward. Plantation owners who attended the pit gained status among their peers. Slave traders who financed it gained profits from betting and from showcasing the physical strength of enslaved men they later sold for higher prices. Judges who visited the arena were reminded of something important. Power meant immunity. Inside the pit, there were no laws, no witnesses who mattered, no consequences. That illusion of immunity is what every corrupt system depends on, the belief that the walls are strong enough to hide what happens inside. But history teaches a brutal lesson. Every system eventually produces the force that destroys it. The Roman Empire built gladiator arenas where enslaved fighters were forced to kill for entertainment. Centuries later, rebellions led by men like Spartacus nearly shattered Roman authority. The French monarchy built a society where aristocrats lived in unimaginable luxury while peasants starved. Then came the French Revolution, and the streets of Paris ran red. Powerful systems always believe they are permanent, until they aren't. The pit in New Orleans was simply a smaller version of the same pattern. Men who controlled wealth and law gathered secretly to indulge their cruelty. They believed the enslaved fighters beneath them were nothing more than tools, animals trained to entertain. But tools observe their masters. Animals remember pain. And people forced into silence begin studying the structure that cages them. 9 years. That is how long Asha watched the arena from the sand. 9 years of memorizing which men attended, which nights they gathered, where the oil was stored, where the support beams ran along the balcony floor, where the service tunnels led beneath the brick walls. While the crowd saw a savage gladiator fighting for survival, they never realized they were watching a strategist mapping their prison. And here is the part that should disturb you. No one stopped her. Not because she was invisible, but because the powerful never imagine their victims are capable of patience. Arrogance blinds power more effectively than darkness ever could. The men in the balcony believed they controlled the arena. They believed the fighters below them existed only to perform. They believed fear would keep everyone obedient forever. But they misunderstood something fundamental about human nature. Suffering does not only break people, sometimes it sharpens them. Sometimes it creates something far more dangerous than anger: clarity. And once a person sees the structure of power clearly, they begin searching for its weakest point.
Asha found that point in dry wood and lantern oil. And when the fire started spreading beneath the balcony, the machine of cruelty built by the elite began devouring its own creators. That night in 1857 was not simply revenge, it was a demonstration, a message whispered through smoke and ash. No system built on domination is truly safe, because the people forced to live inside it are always studying the exits, and sometimes they are also studying where to place the fire.